So, this is the second episode of Global Voices, the Critical Knowledge Podcast. And today's episode runs under the theme The Future of Democracy and Civil Society Engagement in Light of COVID-19. And today, we want to be a bit more practical and pragmatic. Last episode, we had the aim to historically contextualize COVID-19 with the help of two very knowledgeable epidemiologists. But today, we want to go back to what CEA Critical Edge Alliance is about in the first place. I think Critical Edge Alliance is about educating the citizens of the future, and it's first and foremost about innovation and criticality in education, and about the important role of education within society. So, at all Critical Edge Alliance universities, the central question is, how can we educate the citizens of the future? But in order to be able to answer these questions in any relevant way, the underlying questions are, first and foremost, what does citizenship of the future even mean? We are in the Anthropocene, but we are also, as we can see now, in a media society, or rather in a society filtered through certain media. And this observation has struck me when the lockdown happened here in Denmark, because I felt a certain powerlessness because of my dependence on technology. Also, this podcast right now would not be happening without certain technologies. This made me feel, as I said, powerless, dependent on media, and also it was challenging for me. And what I wrote down in an essay trying to express this feeling was, the algorithms and echo chambers of the internet will make me incapable of expressing anything truly provocative, critical, or radical, not because of the content itself, but because the internet is a large filter that makes sure that everyone receives only the content that they already agree with. The medium is the message. And so, this is a citation from Marshall McLuhan, Understanding Media, and his insight was that the way a medium affects society is more important than the content within this medium. So the medium itself and the characteristics of this medium affect society rather than the message itself, the message being in a sense almost a bit trivial or secondary. And this makes me ask questions that are quite relevant to our guests tonight. What do emancipation and democracy entail in the 2020s? How can civil society organize in times dominated by digital communication technology? We hope to be able to discuss about what democracy, emancipation, activism, and civic engagement entail in light of COVID-19, and use that as a starting point for a discussion about the public sphere of the future.
Thank you, Sasha, for giving us an insight into today's episode. It is great to have such a fascinating combination for today. While we try to touch the ideas of democracy, civic engagement, and technology, we have two people who fit the bill very well. Doug Schuler from the US is a professor at Evergreen State College in Washington. He has degrees in mathematics, software engineering, and computer science. He has co founded and runs the Public Sphere Project, which aims to create and support equitable and effective public spheres all over the world. And to complement him, we have Siddhesh Sharma, an alumnus of Tata Institute of Social Sciences, where he studied education and psychology, who co founded and presently heads an organization called Leadership for Equity. He aims to work towards a more inclusive and equitable society by empowering public education systems. We welcome you both to our show. So, Doug, I would like to start with you. Can you tell us a little more about what you do and what factors led you to them?
I taught at the Evergreen State College for 20 years, and I'm now emeritus there. So I'm not teaching there at the moment. I'm still in touch with a lot of people. In fact, I'm going to be giving a presentation down there. I'm not going to the college, but via Zoom, I'm going to be giving a presentation next week on my work on using pattern languages for the Green New Deal, which I'd been working on before this pandemic hit everybody. And so I've been working with technology. My background is in software engineering, and I have a computer science degree also. And I've been teaching at Evergreen for I had been teaching 20 years or so, but my focus, what I've come to realize is what I really believe I needed to focus on was what I call civic intelligence. And so it's completely all about how we think and act together. So putting that focus on both my research and my activism, and really many aspects of my life, it seems like it's kind of a war going on between civic ignorance and civic intelligence, and that's it plays out in the media, it plays out in educational systems. It's I find it sort of central, and I can, and I made it very central to my teaching at Evergreen. I had the freedom to do that there. It's sort of a radical school in that way. I'll just stop there, and I know that I can have a chance to get into some of these other points as we go along.
All right. Thank you, Doug, for this introduction. I'm sure we're going to touch on the concept of civic intelligence later on in this podcast. But first of all, I would like to hear from our other guest, Sidesh, who's calling in from Mumbai. I know that you work a lot with education, but I would like to know what activities you've been engaging in and what kind of education you're engaging yourself for, and why.
So thank you, Sasha and Shreya, for having me over. It's indeed an honor to be part of this. It's been 4 years since I can call myself a formal student. I was part of the inaugural Critical Edge Alliance conference in Denmark in Roskilde. So it was great to be associated with this group since the beginning, and I'm happy to be here. Something that I've working in a country like India, what I've seen is that there is with the rise of the neoliberal structure of education, there's a lot of attack on the way public education systems are seen. So what I'm setting out to do is, I firmly believe that the heart of social equity and the firm backbone of social equity is a free and fair public education system for everyone, because that's where is the melting pot of people across citizens across caste, class, race, gender, and so on. So and that's what I want to empower back in India, because that has been very, very gradually eroded away, where only now the poorest of the children go to the public schools, where anyone with even a modicum of income goes to a low-income private school or a private school, and so on. So that is something, and that is that engenders a stratification in society that is deeply problematic. So that is something that I'm working towards, and there are multiple things that we do, which I will not get into, given the context of the current discussion. And I'm really excited to be here and share what little I have observed, either about politics, because I've worked with the ministry in my state very closely, or about civil societies, because I represent on paper civil society, as well as my strong opinions and little bit of understanding of democracy.
So for you, the question is also about educating the citizens of the future. Is that correct?
Absolutely. I think that's a question for anyone working in education, because given the situation that we are, the strong prediction that is coming from across the board is that we are not dealing with a problem of postponement of current goals. We're dealing with a problem of radically changing the way the social fabric is going to be constructed. And if that is true, and how are we preparing for education? And we cannot think of education the same way we've been thinking of for the last 50 years. So of course, that is central to something that we're all working on, but we still don't have clear answers.
What challenges does this current pandemic bring to the forefront in terms of your activism? And can you really do what you normally do using technological means from home?
So I'll try to answer, and also it's not activism that we directly engage with. We are trying to help the state administration and the state ministry really be more equitable and reach out to the large stakeholders, which is what they are mandated to do. So that's what we do. What we are trying to do is let's frame the problem a little bit here. So what we just had the chief of UNICEF yesterday on a panel discussion from Philippines speak about this. Across the world, I think 1.5 billion children are impacted due to this lockdown situation. And even though they might have had access to a school, right now we need to reframe what we even mean by that access, because right now access to learning could potentially be equated to access to technology through which you can learn. So, and across the board, across all countries, 1.5 billion is a figure that he was quoting. So that is the scale of the problem. So secondly, in a developing country like India, which is seeing huge disparities in terms of access to even food and shelter, technology is quite far down the line. So in that case, technology cannot really be the main source or the main medium through which we reach all the students or all the children of learning age. So it's a 4 quadrant matrix of those with high access to high technology, low technology, no technology, and so on. And what are the different media we are using to reach out to them? So television, community radio, empowering community organizations who are working in different areas to ensure basic literacy and reading goals are met. And then, of course, you've got WhatsApp and Telegram broadcast channels. You've got India has set up this nationwide learning repository, which has got open educational resources. So technology is used for those who have access. For those who don't, we're still figuring out ways to reach them and make it fair. So that is the scale of the problem. 1.5 billion children across the world. In India, more than 225 million children, and most of them without access to learning at this point of time. So that's the scale which we're looking at, and a combination of tech and no tech in order to reach them.
Well, it's definitely interesting to hear this reflection on what's going on in India from you, because it makes the listeners and me also aware that access to technology is not something to be taken for granted at all. And Doug, regarding American society, you've proposed earlier on this dichotomy between civic ignorance and civic intelligence. I thought that was interesting, and I would like to hear from you. How can civic intelligence help in preparing American society or societies in general for future challenges? And as a sort of open addition to that, what are you surprised by and what are you not surprised by or in the context of this outbreak that we are all in?
Well, that's it's a great question. I'm sort of picking up on what I was surprised by, and I think I was surprised by a lot of things that I shouldn't have been surprised by, and also some things that seem to be totally surprising seem almost mundane at the moment, which is sort of weird. One day everything was sort of going along in the usual way, and then a few days later we were all locked up, and so here I am, and I'm in Seattle, which is a pretty high-tech place, and so and I've been in the computer world for a long time, and so and I knew that and I was aware of this pandemic possibility from sort of the start, but for some reason it doesn't seem that surprising at the moment. I'm learning more things sort of about it all the time. I don't know. I'll just back up. The one thing that's hard to take is that there's been like a global economic collapse almost. I heard in New York State that manufacturing was down 75%. So I don't know where we're going with all of this, but from a civic intelligence point of view, what we need to do is sort of muddle our way, keep ourselves safe, and get through this situation. But ideally, we want to be able to learn from this situation, and we want to be sort of more prepared for the future. So it's all about future thinking, even though it's sort of trying to take care of people now. Some of the surprising things are how innovative people are. I'm seeing quite a bit of that. For example, in the schools, I don't know where it is now, but in the schools there was a lot of talk of just getting rid of grades entirely this quarter because or this semester because it's not really fair. The people that are low income and they're having to take care of their family, they don't have access to technology, etc. They're going to be on the losing end again, and so they were saying, well, let's not have grades. And then some people are saying, the U.S. has all of these people that are incarcerated for very minor crimes. I think it keeps the prison industry humming along, having all these people that don't belong there. Anyway, in some of the states, they've been letting these people out, and it's so it's 6 months ago this would have been unthinkable. So there's all sorts of things that are quite different, and I'm seeing some very innovative things. Gratitude towards health workers is really they always deserve our gratitude, but they don't always get it in public ways, and I'm seeing that. And then also, of course, there's the real possibility for the people in charge to exploit more, steal more, spy more, and there's evidence that a lot of that is going on while we're sequestered in our houses.
So, yeah, I guess we could say that it's a global phenomenon that this pandemic has brought to the forefront or amplified vulnerabilities or systemic issues that have already been kind of lingering in the background before the pandemic. But I think that there's also an aspect here to be picked up that you just brought up, which is about grades, that I thought was interesting. So, because that has made me think that in a way, the way that we've organized politically or as societies in modernity is always around a certain kind of numeric order. For instance, grades or global scaling units, which of course is extremely important for science, but also the GDP, which is measured in a certain way and then every year has to increase by a certain percentage. Otherwise, the economy is not doing well. And so we have this kind of numeric routine, and some of that is disrupted by this pandemic. The GDP or the grades, as you bring up. So do you think that this pandemic might change certain aspects of society and political organization forever?
Well, that's again, that's a great question. Back to the always putting numbers on things. I did have the good fortune to be teaching at Evergreen. It was one of the few colleges in the United States where we don't have grades and we had narrative evaluations, and so I didn't really particularly like writing them all the time, but I knew that they're vastly superior to the grades. Also, this in the U.S. and probably around the world, there's this big focus on datafication and more data, and this belief that that everything you need is in that data. And so I've always said, like, one of the problems of capitalism is it's such a game, and it's right on the point system. Some of the points are in dollars, some of the points are in other currency, but it's still if you rule everything by these numbers, you just miss out. I mean, it's almost, I don't want to say a total diversion, but you certainly don't want to just focus on the scale. Now, whether I do want to talk about new forms of political mobilization and that sort of thing, but I have a feeling that this algorithmification and datafication and gamification, all of these sort of gaming score tallying processes are really working against us. And I would like to think that they would be fading into the background, but I don't know. We shall see. I'm kind of in the belly of the beast here with, Amazon doesn't quite rule our city, even though they try. So where we're going in the long run, I'm more short run oriented. I want to come back to a lot of these things, but I'm always afraid of taking more of the airspace. So let me stop there.
I'd like to come in here, if that's okay.
Yes, I was about to ask for your comments, so please go on.
Right. So thanks, Doug. A really good perspective and a good, like, a warning against the datafication and the overuse, and like data is the new oil, and it's like a panacea to everything. I understand how all of that is coming from. I'd like to paint a picture from the point of view of administrations in the developing economy. So right now, before we go into all of this, definitely we should do a discussion on setting up the magnitude of the problem vis-a-vis citizenship, civil society, participation, as well as democracy and the nation state and so on. But just responding to this point, so an administration, even whether in a pandemic or outside of it, needs at every point of time to ensure that services are reaching the most deserving or the most marginalized citizens. So in order to do that, a decently competent administration needs to at least know in its geography or in its jurisdiction how many citizens does it have who are considered as beneficiaries for a particular scheme. So having worked in the ministry, specifically in the education department for the last as an advisor for the last 4 years, what I'm seeing is, if you ask any district administrator how many citizens or how many students who are beneficial for this scheme, nobody has the same number to give. So while yes, definitely I'm over emphasis on data, statistics, and the over numerification of society and administration, all of that fully acknowledged. Right now I'm coming from a space of such callous incompetence or lack of capability that at the very basic, we don't know how many people or how many students are eligible for the midday meal in this particular constituency or in this particular ward. And that is something, just to give a counter perspective to the other extreme of over surveillance, over numerification and all of that. We need societies to first catch up with just the basic principles of effective administration in terms of getting your numbers right, and then not to make too much use of them to the detriment of society is the next step. So just wanted to paint that counter picture to give that perspective of diversity.
I'd like to just pick up on that. I totally agree. I come from I have a degree in mathematics and I'm a computer scientist. I'm very interested in data. All this information about the pandemic, trying to get the numbers right, trying to expose when people are hiding the numbers. All of this is very important. I'm also very interested in the Green New Deal and trying to come to terms with climate change. And I think numbers are important. And so I really agree with Sudesh is that we need numbers. We want numbers. I believe that numeracy it should be part of the curriculum in school. I think that that this is all very related to politics and civic intelligence, in the sense that the people that seem to be denying the reality of the pandemic seem to be the same people that were denying the reality of climate change. And at least in the U.S., they seem to be emanating from these red states where the Republicans are in charge, and the educational levels are low and getting lower, and health measurements are actually getting lower too. So you could see the effects of sort of bad governance. But we have Trump. There's other people around the world that are these strong men rulers, and they make a big show of not believing science, and their records on treatment of minorities and women, etc., are dismal, and I almost think that's a bigger crisis than anything else, because if there's a mass of people that are completely divorced from what's going on and completely want to blame everything on somebody else, there's no chance of having any sort of compassionate society or intelligent society where we deal effectively with the problems that are facing us. Yeah. Stop there.
Yeah, thank you, Doug. I think it's really interesting how you mentioned that education, health, and then if I can call it science literacy, where people believe in climate change, they're all related, very correlated to each other. I think I would like to have both of your comments on something that I think we've also almost discussed this, but what have you been most surprised with since the lockdown and the pandemic have happened? Like, there were some expected things, but what was something that you didn't think would happen and it still happened? We'd start with Doug, and then maybe Sudesh can answer after that.
Let me think. That's a great question. The surprising thing is, to me, one of the things is maybe shouldn't be surprising, but is the air quality and the kind of the somewhat of rewilding of the world, because all these economic systems are being shut down. And I'm not saying, oh, this is this is still an emergency for many reasons, but people in Venice were saying, wow, we can actually we can see the bottom of these canals, and fish are coming back and birds are coming back, and the world is less noisy. And so that's been surprising to me. The other thing that should have been not surprising, but was surprising, I guess, especially from a civic intelligence point of view, is how quickly some of these adaptations are happening at Evergreen. I'm watching it from afar because, like I say, I'm retired, but all of a sudden they are teaching all of their classes online, and they're being very, very creative. And so, if you would have asked them 6 weeks ago, or whatever, 3 months ago, if they would like to teach all their classes online, I don't think anybody would say, yes, let's do that. I don't want to be present with the students. But they're adapting, and so it, on some level, I do have some faith in people to kind of do the right thing when they're called upon to do it. And like I say, there's all sorts of innovative little mutual aid things that are happening, and people are taking care of they're trying to at least take care of older people in the community. And yes, I guess that's what I would say is my surprises.
Doug. I'll keep my response specific to India and the context I'm familiar with, more than commenting on any global trends. The most surprising thing has been the efficiency and the swiftness and the decisiveness with which the political and the administrative leaders have acted. I honestly did not expect such a decisive and quick action by everyone involved, whether it is the Prime Minister or the Chief Minister. Of course, the decisiveness has also resulted in a lot of other consequences, specifically for the migrants and multiple other issues. But if you ask me what surprised me, that definitely surprised me. I thought they were going to downplay it and not take it that seriously. So that was one. Secondly, what I have seen is the rate at which technology has been adopted by the average middle class citizen. For example, teachers, say government school teachers, the last person who you would expect to adopt technology so quickly, and they're doing it. It's Maharashtra always had about 100,000 tech savvy teachers. We have 700,000 teachers totally, but 100,000 of them were tech savvy or certified so. And they have been using Zoom. They have been creating WhatsApp groups for their children, and it's been really, really great and heartwarming to see that. Similarly, with the education officials whom we directly work with, which is the middle management in the education department. Again, one of the most slower or not the first people to adopt technology that willingly. But they have been adopting Zoom calls, virtual conferences, any other virtual tools and so on. And it's been great to see engagement. For example, over the past year, we probably could have expected 1 hour of virtual engagement with any education officials. That too, if at all they have the infrastructure, they have a room to do a VC and so on. Right now, just on Zoom, we have steadily increasing in the last 15 days. We have had steadily increasing engagements on statewide webinars of at least 300 people per day. In fact, today we were interacting with the Education Minister of Delhi, and we had 1,500 people across Facebook Live and Zoom interacting with the Education Minister of Delhi, and 1,000 officers sitting in Maharashtra. And that is fascinating to see in the way which just using a smartphone, people are able to adopt technology, whom we would have never pinned. So the way we need to think about engagement with stakeholders, whether in civil society organizations or elsewhere, is technology is going to be an indelible part of it. It's quite fast. And which is again linked to the third point which I'm coming to, is global collaboration. So just 3 days ago or 2 days ago, we had a panel consisting of experts from Peru, Colombia, Columbia University in the US, and multiple other countries like we have Philippines, Nepal, and so on, and the UK. And it was hitherto unthinkable of having all of these experts under the same roof addressing the audience that they were addressing, because the education administrators, again I'm speaking from a very narrow sense, have not had that exposure before. But to have that and make that possible over using technology and the internet has been just fabulous. And the way that they are now seeing the possibility, okay, we can now reach out to, so my borders are no longer confined to where I can physically go, and that's fantastic. So we now have officers requesting, can we speak to officers from other states, can we expose our children and do some exchange program with our children, with children in other countries, and so on. So that has been something. It is not that these things were never happening, but they were happening, say, to 0.5% of the population. Now the way the population is adopting all of these and the scale at which it is happening is staggering. So this has been the real surprise for me.
So if I kind of put together a point made by Doug and add to that a point made by Siddesh, the point by Doug being about people taking care of one another, and Siddesh's point being about new ways of global collaboration. This makes me think of, in all this chaos that we're in right now, it makes me think of a different way of making sense of the way that the world is nowadays. And this is through the term local global. So the local and the global. I mean, I'm sitting in my room right now and I'm talking to people from all over the world. So what comes after my local sphere that surrounds me, if we're talking about virtual technology and global interdependence, very quickly and maybe primarily is global. So, and in between there's maybe not that much, or maybe there's only chaos in between. And so in a way, politics also has to occur on those two spheres, in the local communities and on the global level. And so I think this relates to dissemination of information as well, because the World Health Organization, for example, passes a certain paper or information on to national governments, and these national governments then translate this information to their constituencies, to the citizens of their countries, and then the media in these national contexts picks up that information and translates it again. So in a way, there are three different filters that information has to go through. And if we look at it from the other level, not starting from the global and then going to the local, but from the other way around, there's a lot of local information that is highly relevant to the people who are there and completely irrelevant to everyone else. But still, it may spread around the world anyway. And so the question is, first of all, to Siddesh, and then Doug can also jump in. How can we disseminate information that is globally relevant in a way that is globally, in a global forum or globally distributed? And how can we create political systems that put more emphasis onto the local sphere at the same time as well, in such a way that we come to perceive ourselves as local and global citizens who are interconnected and interdependent?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a definitive answer to that, because the divides of language, culture, and so on are quite. I mean, we still need to figure out a way to surmount that, unless we figure out a way to communicate without. I mean, communicate the basics without resorting to verbal language. So, which is of course possible with the visual narratives that we have, using animations and so on. So, of course, there is that. What I'm trying to understand is are we already at the cusp of that global citizenship, or is there already this dichotomy of the local community, which some experts are saying is already feeling distanced by the national community? because due to the distancing, all that I know as a citizen is whether my community is being sealed or not, or whether essentials are going to be available in my community or not, who in my community or in my locality has contracted the disease or not. There is a hyper awareness about one's local community and some level of distancing from the national community, because we feel that there is some orders or structures coming from there, but there's hyper awareness of the local community. So if you extend that to the perspective of the world, I'm not really sure if that dichotomy has completely been erased for those who are again disconnected from technology, and for those who depend just on like a community person or the radio for their news, and don't get their news on social media or through internet blogs and so on, to be able to do that. So if dissemination, like for example, even distribution of food is a huge concern to millions of people in India, and the news is something that does not even reach them. So when we're talking about dissemination at that level, which is like completely global, I'm not sure whether we are still there yet, but I may be wrong. I may still have a very microscopic view. So maybe Doug can elaborate on what he's seeing as some global trends on this.
Second, I one thing I picked up on was this idea of are we on the cusp of a global citizenship realm or a regime or whatever. My kind of stubborn insistence on the idea of civic intelligence, one of the reasons that I really like to put it that way, at least the way I interpret that concept, is that it's really all about human agency. And so whenever I hear some, when I'm reading the literature, there's this impulse, I think, in science or scholarly work to come up with something that's sort of abstract and out there, and civic intelligence has to do with the ability of people to do it correctly. I kind of define it as addressing significant problems effectively and equitably. And so the equitably part has to be in there, or somebody will solve it with the numbers, and then it won't be done right. And so I think that one thing, and I think I can tie these both in, is that when I think of the global citizenship, I've gone to these conferences and events, really in Asia, in Africa, in South America, Europe, and generally I agree. I mean, that is a community, and it's fairly cosmopolitan. Then people are literate, people are concerned about the outside world, etc. And I love to talk with people, from different cultures and different places that have different outlooks, but basically they believe kind of we're all in this together. My way of thinking, or my people aren't better than your people necessarily, but it's easy to get carried away and think that that's dominant. And you asked, or I was asked earlier, what surprised me. I was surprised when Trump was elected, or he wasn't really maybe fairly elected, but he became the president of the United States. That was, to me, we had lost our idea what a leader looked like, how they behaved, and I don't know if that was because people were afraid, but it really suggested to me that the level of civic intelligence had dropped kind of into dangerous territory, and something like a pandemic can happen when it can start scaring people, and you start not letting people into your city from out of state because they're going to bring the virus with. And so there's a certain amount of paranoia and distrust of the outsider and xenophobia, and so then tying that into what we're thinking about education is one thing that I really tried to fight back against with my teaching at Evergreen was this idea that the professor had all the answers and all the students had to do was sit and listen, and then they would know how to proceed, when to me almost the most important thing is for students to be aware that they have some degree of self-efficacy. They're allowed to ask questions. They're allowed to continue on a quest where they can learn things that aren't necessarily known. And I should stop there, but before we go, I would like to talk a little bit about this pattern language work that I've been doing, that's kind of an offshoot or an instantiation of the civic intelligence work.
Yes, please.
So, okay. Short version is maybe 10 or so years ago. Okay, first of all, there's a thing called a pattern language. That is it's a book for architecture and urban planning, and it has 250 patterns in there, and each pattern is sort of it's kind of like a guideline or a way of thinking about part of a problem. And so light on two sides of natural light on two sides of every room is a pattern. It doesn't say, oh, it has to be done this way or that way. It doesn't tell you precisely, but it's just sort of a general guideline, and it's something that's happened over and over again. And the architect that put this together identified those and made this book of all these patterns, what he calls a pattern. All the patterns are organized into a pattern language. And around here, and kind of around the world, people have used this book to design their own house, or they've used it in different ways. Then the computer development people got a hold of this, and they said, well, we can use that pattern language to design, say, the interface for the iPhone, or so they've been the technology group has been using that. What I did, starting about 20 years ago now, was to try to identify patterns for social engagement. And so I worked with 85 people, and I wrote a book that was published by MIT Press in 2008 called Liberating Voices, and it has all these patterns in that. And so I believe that one way to help coordinate a lot of local projects, because really I believe that most of the projects that we do, most of the things we do in relation to the Green New Deal or how to deal with the pandemic, are going to be done not because everybody is agreeing with everybody on everything and they're working with everybody. You're still going to be working with a smaller group. And one way that these groups could sort of be loosely coordinated is if they agreed on some patterns. And so in the book, some of the ones that seem to be relevant are the commons. The commons is something that you acknowledge that, oh, this is this one earth that we live in, and when I throw my trash out, it's affecting somebody else. And another pattern in the book is called community inquiry, and that's when you ask a question and then you strive to find the answer, like, why are they putting the incinerator in our neighborhood? Why is it that the people in our neighborhood, the public schools, are so bad? One of the designs, or one of the patterns in the book, is future design. Another is sense of struggle, and so it's an idea of sort of elevating ideas to just to give them more focus. And so recently I wrote a paper or an article called something like Patterns for the Green New Deal. And it included things like carbon audit. So all these communities can take, that'd be one way that they can focus, and they can do a carbon audit and see how much their community is kind of polluting with CO2. Another one is what's another? Oh, is appropriate mitigation action. And so if some group, say in India, comes up with something that they can do locally, and they kind of describe it, then that mitigation action can be used by other local communities. So I guess that's kind of it in a nutshell. It's not trivial to sort of describe. So I'm hoping we can include the URL for this article and some of these patterns in the description that accompanies the podcast.
Yes, we can certainly do that. And in a way, I'm both happy and unhappy that you bring up Donald Trump, because I wanted to bring him up as well, but not as an important leader, but rather as a distraction. Because if we go back to that idea that I mentioned early on in the podcast, the medium is the message, and we connect that to the idea of equitable participation, then the question really becomes, how can there be equity or equitable participation in the internet if one person has if one person has 1 million followers and other people may have 50 followers or a much smaller outreach, and then there are people who don't even have access or the necessary literacy or economic means to make themselves heard or to participate in any way. I mean, these last people, this last group, they are virtually, and by virtually I mean literally virtually non-existent. So in that sense, I would talk about Trump not as a strong man, but as a loudmouth. And he is a leader in one sense, for sure, and that is in the sense that he has mastered the use of certain mediums, for example, Twitter or other social media, to his benefit. So he is a leader in the sense that he is a pioneer of exploiting or taking advantage of the way that our media works and the flaws of our media system. And so I would like to ask Siddesh, and you are free to interpret this question for the the Indian context. How do you think we can educate the children or the young people who are in school now to be able to understand how these media work? And by that, I don't just mean being a digital native in the sense of being familiar with the culture that is on the surface or in the interface of the internet, but also to be able to understand what is going on behind that surface. And can we, in that way, reach a certain digital emancipation?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. I also wanted to talk about citizenship earlier to the point that you're mentioning earlier, but we can revisit that later. I'll respond to this question. Um, so when we're talking about educating for the future, it's always good to start with one of the famous saying that educators of today are educating the children for problems that we do not yet know of, for them to find solutions that we don't are not yet aware of, or something to that effect. So it's a really convoluted thing that we're trying to do, and this added uh, complication with the pandemic has also arisen. So when we talk about educating the future generations, it's largely the way we're thinking about. I know in the higher education we still talk about interdisciplinarity, and intersectionality and so on. Uh, Whereas I deal with primary education, and primary education is largely still segregated into subjects, into timetables and periods and so on. And it's quite difficult in this setting to reimagine how that's going to look like. However, there's a lot of hope in the entire science and study of 21st century skills, 21st century subjects, and so on. And many countries across the world, Australia, Singapore, have integrated them well into their curriculum. So one of the thing is, instead of thinking of them as school subjects, what one needs to think of them is not just as literacy but literacies, which means it's not just about mathematical or numerical literacy. It's more about financial literacy, eco literacy, information literacy, media literacy, and so on. So, and there are a lot of measurable indicators and outcomes. So how does one really integrate all of these literacies into the, and still figure out all the life skills and social emotional needs, and the fundamental employability skills and so on, that we're going to ensure. So the real thing here is, uh, in the mainstream discourse, is definitely about all of these 21st century skills and 21st century literacies, information literacy being the chief of it, because right now, I think according to the latest PISA report, more than 80% of the 10, 15-year-olds were not able to distinguish between true and fake news, and which was a very disturbing trend, which really called to the spotlight the importance of information and media literacy. The exact figure I'm not remembering, but it was something alarming like that. So that is there in the mainstream discourse. Secondarily, if we look at some aspects of critical pedagogy, what is it that we really want as fundamental aims of education? Are we looking at just uh, replaying the cycle of social inequity that is being perpetuated by education, which is a microcosm and reflection of a society? Or really, through education, do we want to empower the current generation with just a set of cognitive, emotional, intellectual, social tools, to be, and analytical tools, to be able to find solutions to problems that our brains and our minds are so entrenched in that we're not able to think beyond them. So our worldview is whereas in education, what we're doing is we're transferring our worldview to the next generation. So if that is the real purpose of generation, which is a critical, radical pedagogy of uh, empowering the future generations with those cognitive, analytical, emotional, social, etc. tools, to be able to think and do and be their way out of the cycles and the loops that we are finding ourselves in, then we're going to think much. We need to think much deeper than just, of course, the media literacy and so on. So those are the, and fundamentally the structure in which education is designed, implemented, and thought of is should also be with that at the center. Unfortunately, as long as economic profit is at the center, and political power is at the center of society, the current nation state structure will never allow for that. So I know I'm digressing a bit, but that's the idea I want to communicate, that that is the magnitude of the problem. It is not just about being able to distinguish between the post-truth world and so on. Is literally this. If we really mean the sentence that education is the first step towards social change, this is a radical reconstruction of education, the science of it, the teaching of it, and the implementing of it that we need to think of. So just wanted to contextualize that a bit. I hope that answers.
Yeah, so I mean,
What-
yeah, I definitely do think it makes sense. I mean, to put it in simple terms, a teacher who is not tech savvy, as you mentioned, or a student that doesn't have access to or literacy of certain communication technologies is, in a sense, silenced. But what struck me in both of your comments was um, this idea of being able to distinguish in media between what is real and what is unreal. And so this makes me think of an idea that I'd written down as a keyword before this podcast, or about for this podcast, which is the idea of emancipatory education rather than just emancipation by means of education. And what I mean by that is rather than teaching what's fact and what's fiction in school, maybe first of all being able to understand how certain media operate and what they actually are. For example, what an algorithm is and how it behaves. So in a way, then I have a question to also Shreya, because she studies sociology of education and the university, but also, of course, Sidesh and Doug, which is the question, should we be teaching these basic technological skills to students? Can we be teaching them? And who should be in charge of it? Can it be a government, or is that out of proportion? Or will emancipation be more up to people themselves and up to civil society rather than governments or other institutions?
Well, I wouldn't mind jumping in. I I think it's a problem if we say the educational system must provide all of these things, and if it or if we say the educational system won't provide any of these, so we have to completely do it on our own. I think the answer is kind of a hybrid, that we want to push the educational systems to do. I would say, I love the list of all the things that Sidesh mentioned. Those types of literacies are all great. We can sort of push to integrate those into the curriculum, or maybe you could even have a college here and there that was saying that put social change uppermost. That's always great. But I have a feeling that not that we should be satisfied with only doing this, but we figure out how can we carve out some space to do this kind of somewhat open-ended education. And I found some interesting ways to do it at Evergreen. There's lots of sort of loopholes where you can say, oh, this is a special project, so we can do it this way. Also, I think some of this we're going to have to do on our own time. If it's important, we do it through volunteer work. We're going to have, the schools are not going to be ideal, so we're going to have to do sort of work that's kind of off in the margins, and we have to do that. And also, I think one thing that we haven't mentioned really is ideally we want the students to insist on this, and I don't want to put blame on them. It's like blaming the victims, but if the students aren't agitating and saying we want this other sort of educational side, we're not likely to get it. Um, Also, just a quick side note, not side note, but in terms of the pattern language that I developed, I heard that Sudesh mentioned digital emancipation. That's one of our patterns, and then demystification and re-enchantment is a pattern. And I've always been a real fan of demystification. Because having been in computer science and software engineering, people tend to think that technology is sort of magic, and I really would like to sort of strip that out and talk about the things that are really the true mysteries that are left, and think about those too. Also, I just, in terms of this carving out of education, some of the stuff needs to be kind of open-ended and largely student-driven, and because in my view of what we need in terms of civic intelligence is, I want students to have self-efficacy. They need to be not sitting around waiting for instructions from somebody else. They need to have the sort of the drive to go out and ask questions and organize, et cetera. And it's you don't really teach that. I think you provide an environment where that's going to take place. And again, it's not trivial to do it because curriculum are so circumscribed and required courses and this and that. And then I didn't even talk about Trump, which good. Maybe later.
Well, I mean, Trump can be understood in the sense that maybe he's somebody who has understood that magic and re-enchantment and superstition are just part of how our media works. Because I mean, I'm holding this book, Understanding Media by Marshall McLuhan, in my hands right now, and the German translation of the title is Die magischen Kanäle, which means the magical channels. And I mean, in the book, he introduces the idea of film, for example, being a medium that brings a certain re-enchantment into life, if I've understood him correctly. I've only read the first chapters. But of course, we have to be able to demystify what happens in media in order to see through it, in a sense. But about re-enchantment and remystification, in a way, this idea that we talked about earlier about the commons and about local communities, or about everything being connected or interdependence, that is quite spiritual idea in a lot of ways. Love thy neighbor, or the idea of oneness. But as of now, I don't really have another question. I think we brought up so many interesting aspects in this conversation that as of now, I would just ask you to make some closing remarks and to just say what you want to say.
Thanks, Asha. I don't have any generic comments to make. However, there was a certain question you had asked around citizenship. If you can repeat that, maybe I'd like to talk about that a little bit, and education and so on.
Yeah, so the big question really is, what are the citizens of the future? And so maybe to explain what I'm trying to get at here is using an idea that was brought to the forefront in recent political discourse and philosophical discourse by Slavoj Žižek, who talked about the importance of the commons, specifically in terms of the internet and ecology. So both of them are global in a way, global in nature, and systems of interdependence that make up, in a way, the commons of today. And this connectivity brings with it, of course, a certain amount of complexity. which maybe interdisciplinarity is also trying to address. And it's funny that I keep getting back to this book, but the teacher that gave me this book by Marshall McLuhan, he had in our classroom, he had pinned a sentence on the wall. I don't remember who he had cited it from, but the main message of that sentence was that nowadays, in order to grasp the complexity and grasp what's going on in the world, we have to be biologists, we have to be physicists, or we have to be geographers, we have to be geologists, you name it. And yeah, I know that that's a big question, but just the kind of complexity of our current world, is that something that education can tackle, and how can it tackle it? How does education have to adapt?
Yeah, so very complexly laid out question for me to get at. Uh, so I'm in rather than taking all the factors that you mentioned, I'd like to go one level slightly deeper in rather than address the complexity of the internet and the commons and the resultant complexity and the interdisciplinarity and what does that pose to citizenship. Citizenship itself was earlier understood to be a fairly simple thing, and to lend some instead of answering this conceptually the way it is posed, I would like to answer it socially and politically. One is that again in a country like India, and specifically in a post-pandemic situation where globally we are seeing a rise of nationalism, we are seeing a lot of states invoking emergency powers and surveillance. We are seeing a lot of growth in authoritarian leadership, and even that being appreciated. That that's more decisive. It will be safer to do that, and that whole discourse. So that is happening on one end, and with this rise in this situation, we also have legislations like the National Registry of Citizens and the Citizenship Amendment Bill in India. So I know that again this is to a conceptual question. I'm coming socially and politically, but I think that nuance is well worth this digression that I'm making. Is all of that complexity conceptually will come into play only when at a very base level I am assured of my citizenship. But if suddenly overnight, through a legislation, if I find myself stateless or my citizenship in question, owing to whatever religious or national identity that I may or may not possess, what how am I even going to access all the other benefits that come along with citizenship? So that is definitely a question that millions of people in India are living in uncertainty, which is again linked to the entire civic agitation that was gaining incredible momentum in India through the Shaheen Bagh protests, which again, due to the COVID-19 situation, has been disbanded and has seen, and by a lot of the right-wing population, is seen as a victory that, oh, see, in times like this, it is a decisive leadership, and these protesters are not going to be encouraged. So, what I've played out right now is the very basis of citizenship I need to be able to take for granted before I address the much more complex question of interdisciplinarity and the commons and so on. As also what just played out here has been internationally, many experts have been writing about in the trends and patterns that they're seeing in terms of disbanding of protests and so on. So if citizenship guarantees me civic engagement, and neither of which I cannot take my citizenship for granted, and hence I cannot even take my civic engagement and protests and activism and advocacy for granted. Uh, that is a much more fundamental question that needs to be asked and thought about, and specifically commented on in this rising tide of nationalism across countries, whether it is Brazil, Turkey, Russia, all of the China authoritarian wave that we're seeing. That needs to be asked and commented on, and then of course the layer of the complexity that we spoke of needs to concurrently be spoken of. That was on my mind. I felt that uh, as India grappling with these issues, I definitely owed it to me and the millions who are fighting for this to make this point.
Thank you, Siddesh. I think it was a very genuine point about citizenship and nationalism that you mentioned here and the effect that COVID-19 has had on them. I think these are questions that need to be thought about and discussed at this point of time. I also wanted to go back a little on Sasha's earlier question about teaching basic skill to children and who should be teaching them. I I think what Doug mentioned makes a lot of sense. Um, we can't pressurize the education systems to teach everything, nor can we alienate the education system and depend completely on other avenues for learning those skills. A little addition, however, I would make is that when we say that ideally students should insist on it and that students need to organize, I think the protests that Siddesh mentions and even a lot of other protests that were going on in the world earlier are a good example of that, albeit a little differently from how you mentioned right now, but they are still on the same principle, I'd say.
Okay, thank you. So, Doug, when it comes to the United States, what do you think about the citizenship of the future?
I think that citizenship does take different forms in different places. The situation is going to be somewhat different in India than it's going to be in the U.S. I would say that that even within certain countries, it's going to be different for different groups of people. And in Seattle, where 90+% of the population voted against Trump, I'm certainly quite free to say things against him. And certainly I don't think in China saying things against Xi. So citizenship takes different forms in different places, and also I don't think you can ever really count on it because it can be sort of ripped away. And this rising tide of authoritarianism, I don't know what it says about our era. I wonder if it's fear-based or anxiety or what it is. But I think it makes things like what you're doing much, really, really important to work across these boundaries. You don't want to disregard everything local because you're working across boundaries, but the place, in theory, somebody has to be holding this thing together, and not that you can do it all, but you're doing part of it. And I think that in the U.S. now I'm straying, but in the U.S. there's a lot of emphasis on being entertained, and so the amount of hours that people put into playing video games is astronomical. I mean, it's almost infinite. No, it's not almost infinite, but there's just a huge amount, and I don't want to get all the way that people are dealing with things, but yeah. So citizenship takes different forms, and and I don't think you can count on it. But I do think that reaching out and forming these global alliances. Bernie Sanders had a good editorial last year in the Guardian, and really this stuff has to happen, and I do think that it's the globalism on the person to person is so crucial, and I think that it's it's under siege right now, threatened. Really, I really appreciate the efforts that this Global Voices group is doing, and I like the student focus. I like to, as a faculty member, I like to be considered as part of the broader effort, and I'd like to see student leadership. I'd like to, I don't know how to exactly to go about it. I'm interested in federating different units, and maybe there's a lot of the work that I'm interested in is in my Green New Deal article that I link it for, but it's how do we coordinate in a loose, flexible fashion. And so, I wonder if there was a student group at RUC and a student group at the Tata Institute, and they were pretty autonomous, but had sort of the mutual aid or other relationship established that meant, we don't tell each other what to do necessarily, but we're operating under a few different principles, and we'd like to help if you need it, and we're very interested in collaborative efforts, periodicals or protests or podcasts, whatever. And to me, that seems to be the place where we can get the most leverage, almost most efficiently, and it's also what's most needed. People are working on all these projects, and I suspect there's more leverage to be gotten if with a little bit more of this loose collaboration. It's not tight, but it's not disconnected either, and that's where I'm really like to explore, and that's where I actually was thinking that the patterns could provide some benefit. So I'm signing off my little mic.
Thank you for that, Doug. I think students all over can benefit a lot from your guidance, and I think it will be beneficial for all of us if we can have a look at all the work that you've done and what you've spoken about. I'd now go on to Siddesh for final comments.
Thanks, Shreya. And thanks, Doug. This is really insightful. I could really go on listening to you because returning to the world of concepts after the last 4 years of directly working on processes and operational realities is really refreshing. And that's something that's a side of me that I've missed. So thank you so much for introducing me. I'm definitely going to read more about the concepts and the patterns and things that you've mentioned. So thank you so much for that. I would like to just add some of the stuff around citizenship that I was saying earlier, and then give a very basic closing thought. One is, while of course talking about citizenship, specifically with in the context of this pandemic, is also to explore the role of some of the non-state actors that has been quite prominent. Now, what do we mean by that? It could mean the Taliban in Afghanistan, who has been coordinating with the WHO. It could mean some of the drug gangs in Latin America who have imposed curfew in wherever, and also been distributing soaps to all the favelas in the communities. It can mean the Hezbollah, who has been doing some sort of an activity. There's a list of this that has been compiled somewhere, which I was reading a few days ago. Sorry for not being so specific, but this again brings to the question, like, just as the rise of authoritarian can bring into question who is a citizen, who the non-state actors who may or may not be citizens today operating within a country also have a lot of roles to play. Similarly, is problematized and continues to be problematized is when the pressure increases on a state who's anyway strapped for resources to provide services to all its citizens. Suddenly the question of refugees is also going to mount, and this is true not just it's in Asia, also in Europe and everywhere else. So all of this needs to be taken into consideration while thinking about the intersections and the complications or complexities in citizenship. So that was just for me to close that part of my thought. In closing, I'd like to say that while, of course, while thinking about the future of education in parallel with citizenship, democracy, civic engagement, and so on, uh, a lot of thought is being given by academic scholars and experts on the what and the why. What needs to be done? Why is it important? What is going to be the modality? And also some guidelines of how it can be done and what are the steps that we need to be able to take. My interest professionally has for the last 3 to 4 years has been in the how, because what large state administrations really require, uh, I'm only talking in the context of India, where there are varying ranges of capabilities among the people in the administration, is this entire change management, for the lack of better word, of how do we get from this point where we're clueless about A, B, and C and good at C, D, and E, to a point where we are fulfilling the problems, predicting the problems that are going to be arising in the society, so on, empowering the children and serving the citizens in the way that they need to be served and empowered in the future society. So this getting them from point A to point B, filling the skill gap that definitely will be there in the administration to do that, is going to be really important. So as much as civic engagement and civil society help is required in the domain of protest, in the domain of activism, in the domains of advocacy and agency, and making our voice heard, maybe a new type of civic engagement, if in governments which are more porous and which are more open, that there could be this possibility of being this thought partner, this knowledge partner, or this implementation partner to administrations, while still being non-profits, to sort of slowly take them, because end of the day, it's people running the system, and they are also citizens, and they're also figuring out a lot of these and navigating a lot of these anxieties. So how do we get the people in these administrative systems to go from point A to point B while leading the larger populace along with them? So that is something that I'm interested in doing, and interested in helping others who feel that this is a thing that they might want to work on, to think through, and also any opportunities to sort of work with us to do this in India. So those are my closing thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Doug and Sidesh, for joining us today. I think this episode has given us all a lot to think about, like the ideas of citizenship, nationalism, forming citizens of the future. I'm also thinking how the definitions of demystification and re enchantment would change now that we have a virus amongst us that is mysterious and magical and out of the realm of technology.
Yeah, thank you, Sidesh, and thank you, Doug, for your contributions to Global Voices. Today, the podcast being about the future of democracy and civil society engagement in light of COVID-19. We've certainly touched on a few different aspects, and we've gotten a view of an American scholar and an Indian scholar. And yeah, I think we have put a finger on the kind of front lines and problems of the present and the future in a quite interesting way. So thank you for that.